So, welcome back to another episode of There's Been Growth, the Council Podcast, and it's me again, Rod. And today we are going to be talking about boundaries. I felt like it was important to follow up with this as the first episode after the introduction episode because boundaries are just that important. And they're one of the most important things that no one ever really talks about. We might enforce them or suffer from a lack of having them, but there is so much power in exploring what your current boundaries are, or even what they should be. Boundaries define what we deem as acceptable or even unacceptable in a relationship. Boundaries can be different based on the type of relationship you have with someone or lack of relationship that you have with someone. It really just depends on the dynamics of that relationship. But by creating expectations and communications and needs in that way, it's easier to feel safe and comfortable in your relationships. For me, it has been that case. The boundaries not communicated that are violated. And by creating expectations and communicating what your needs are, it makes it a lot easier to feel safe and comfortable in the relationships that you have. For me, it's been the case that boundaries not communicated that are violated can end in resentment. And for those of you that have truly felt it, know that can definitely be a relationship killer. As much as it feels like it has something to do with the other person, it usually has much more to do with you and not honoring your needs in terms of communicating them or even establishing boundaries. So where does this even come from? So boundaries honestly can start or are established in childhood, but especially in the Black household, they are usually punished as seen as being disobedient or acting out. And this for me is why of many things that it's important to do or in terms of how to treat children. It's very important to let children have preferences, let children voice their opinions, especially around things like what they like to eat, wear, or what they allow or don't allow in their physical space or even who. Because honestly, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but a lot of adulthood is unpacking and undoing a lot of the harm done to us, even if often unintentionally, as children. So boundaries for me has been a huge area where that was lacking. And that was honestly the root of a lot of discomfort in my life. And it's honestly still something that I continue to work on every day. I don't think boundaries is one of those things that's kind of static. You set it and forget it. It's one of those things that constantly evolve as you get to know yourself more, as you go out into the world and have other experiences, new experiences. You can further establish and grow those boundaries as needed. It's never something that's just done. So in terms of types of boundaries, there's porous boundaries, weak or easily breached boundaries, rigid, you're very firm in those boundaries, and even healthy, which is kind of self-explanatory, just right, like Alice's porch, not too hot, not too cold, just healthy type of boundaries. And honestly, only you, and this is important, only you can know what boundaries you may need or what those boundaries should look like. A while back, I did an exercise with my therapist where we discussed different types of boundaries, and we went through what thoughts came up for me for those boundaries, and it really aided in helping me identify where I needed maybe better boundaries or certain places where I honestly had never considered the boundaries. And so in this episode, based off of that exercise, I thought it'd be good to try to kind of talk through different types of boundaries, share some of my personal experiences in a hope that maybe it prompts you to think about where you stand with your boundaries. Have you considered all your boundaries? And honestly take something away that, can be truly helpful, because in terms of there's been growth, turning 30, boundaries I have established are very, very, very important in terms of walking into your full self, being comfortable in who you are, and truly controlling your life in a way that creates positive outcomes. Let's get jumping into the types of boundaries. So the first boundary is physical boundaries, which refer to the personal space and physical touch. Healthy physical boundaries include an awareness of what's appropriate and what's not in various settings and types of relationships, hugs, shaking hands, or kissing. Physical boundaries may be violated if someone touches you when you don't want them to, or when they invade your personal space, for example, rummaging through your bedroom. So, like most Black people, I don't like people putting their finger in my face when talking to me or pointing their finger at me. Although that is a small, It really depends on the person. A small boundary that I feel like most of us share, it really is a good example of what this boundary means. We could take it also a step deeper. For me, this boundary shows up in spaces like the club, at a party, in the gym, wondering how do I establish what feels right when others are in close proximity to me. My home also is a very safe space for me, and it really prompted me to be more intentional about, especially having social anxiety, what feels comfortable with me in public spaces, what does not feel comfortable with me in public spaces. Being tall, standing out, being a thicker man, it's not a coincidence to me, or it's not a surprise to me that people are more inclined to want to touch. But if that doesn't feel comfortable to me, how do I establish those boundaries? And in terms of my house, I'm a homebody. I love my home. It's a sacred space for me. And how do I extend that to who I allow in my space and who I don't allow in my space, and how I conduct myself or when I do have people in my space? So the next one is intellectual boundaries, which refers to thoughts and ideas. Healthy intellectual boundaries include respect for others' ideas and an awareness of appropriate discussion. Should we talk about the weather or politics? Intellectual boundaries are violated when someone dismisses or belittles another person's thoughts or ideas. So for this one, I kind of took what potentially might be a different approach, just to put it out there and be very clear. I'm very keen on trying to respect everyone, whether they are present in that space or not. That goes for their culture, their sexuality, their gender, all the things that truly just makes them them. I feel we all we all deserve like that basic level of respect. But, I've learned that in meeting and talking to people, there's some people that choose to be willfully ignorant and do not mind disrespecting others. For example, I once was at a bar with a ex now friend, and the topic of Chloe Bailey came up, and through talking about her evolution through music, one of the comments that came out of their mouth was, I just wish that she would stop shaking her ass every 2 minutes, in connection to the fact that, he just sees her as more of a child or not in that light. And, based on what I told you earlier in this that I stand for, that comment was not cool to me. And through the back and forth it took to get to a level of expressing that and, pushing the narrative that, what a female does with her body is none of our motherfucking business, or, how dare you speak on a woman like that, especially a Black woman, of all things. Just the hurdles to get that across made me realize that, there truly has to be some type of better boundaries around values and what's shared, and when to disengage an intellectual conversation when it is clear that the person just isn't on the same page as you when it comes to that. It's a lot easier to save that energy than to spend it going back and forth with someone that is truly just not aligned with you and is going to continue to violate your boundaries as time goes on. So that was definitely a realization for me, and we'll get into friends and what that looks like deeper in another episode, but that is kind of how that showed up for me for intellectual boundaries. So emotional boundaries. These refer to a person's feelings. Healthy emotional boundaries include limitations on when to share and when not to share personal information. For example, gradually sharing personal information during the development of a relationship as opposed to revealing everything to everyone. Emotional boundaries are violated when someone criticizes, belittles, or invalidates another person's feelings. So for me, as I said in the initial episode, I try to practice vulnerability. It's really, really important to me. But I will say that in that, I've definitely had to be more intentional about establishing emotional boundaries. I've reached a point in my life, honestly, where I just don't care a lot about what other people think. Still do care a twinge, but it's just honestly not a whole lot. So in that, I tend to share more freely because my life is mine and ain't nobody else's, and I really don't care. But, still with that, I've had to learn what boundaries look like around that, and learning to pace that with where I am in a relationship or in connection with someone. Because honestly, it really boils down to the fact that everybody doesn't deserve to know you like that. Even though you might feel that you don't care what others think, or you may feel that, you don't mind sharing these things, the wholeness and greatness of who you are, everyone just does not deserve to experience that. So for me, that's where the boundary came in. And so I've learned to try to pace and to read the room when it comes to relationships and not just, have word vomit. I will say a huge distinction in that is, lack of sharing is not from a place of shame. I truly don't believe in that. I see a lot of people joking and saying, oh, you couldn't waterboard this information out of me. And it really comes back to the point that boundaries are for individuals to set and to create. And, outside of that, it really becomes none of our business. So then we get to sexual boundaries. Sexual boundaries refer to the emotional, intellectual, and physical aspects of sexuality. Healthy sexual boundaries involve mutual understanding and respect of limitations and desires between sexual partners. Sexual boundaries can be violated with unwanted sexual touch, pressure to engage in sexual acts, leering, or sexual comments. This boundary really made me further explore the idea of consent. Just because we are hot and heavy in a moment of mutual attraction does not mean that there is implied consent. There is never a time where consent can't be revoked. And also, being intoxicated makes consent tricky, and that also cannot be ignored. As in tricky, if someone is intoxicated and does not have a clear mind, then how can they truthfully provide consent? Let's really, turn these brains on and think about it. I do feel like all this has become more of a topic in broader discourse around sex, and I am truly happy to see that. I could think about years ago where consent was not really a topic that came up like that. Or you think about victims of rape or people that have experienced sexual assault and how, people tend to side with the person that committed the act instead of the person that experienced it. I think that more conversations around consent has really helped people see that from a different perspective. And also, if it was not clear, I'm always on the side of those affected by sexual harassment or rape. I don't condone victim shaming. We don't do that. No, no, no. To take that further personally, for me growing up and feeling undesired due to not being, comfortable with my height, whatever, blah, blah, blah. I realized that I sometimes conflated consent with mutual attraction. Just because someone was attracted to me and I to them or showed me attention automatically meant that I was to give them consent of my body. And that just truly isn't the case. It definitely prompts for more conversation ahead of sexual activities, including what the other person enjoys in sex and even how they like to initiate sex, and also what consent looks like for them. You establish sexual boundaries that is truly a thing. But in that, you figure out what does it look like to initiate, what does it look like to consent, what makes you truly feel comfortable as it relates to sex. So the next one is material boundaries. Material boundaries refer to money and positions. Healthy material boundaries involve setting limits on what you will share and with whom. For example, it may be appropriate to lend a car to a family member, but definitely probably not to a perfect stranger that is insisting on borrowing your car or someone that you barely know. I don't really have a lot to say on this one as it's pretty self-explanatory. Don't let people that you don't trust or don't like borrow your shit. It is your prerogative to give or not give of your things. People can be mad, and that is absolutely okay. We will all be a villain in somebody's story at some point or another. And that's not something that is completely inside of your control. But what is inside of your control are these boundaries that we're talking about right now. So the next one, and also the last one, is time boundaries. These refer to how a person uses their time. To have healthy time boundaries, a person must set aside enough time for each facet of their life, such as work, relationships, and hobbies. Time boundaries are violated when another person demands too much of another's time. You cannot pour from an empty cup. You have to be very intentional about building boundaries around your time that allow you to recharge and keep your cup full. That oftentimes means being selfish. Again, you always will be the villain in someone's story at some point in time. And, what better place to be that than when it comes to taking time for yourself and for what you need. Thankfully, I've always been pretty intentional about having my own space or having boundaries around time. It mostly is due to me being a homebody and having social anxiety, although I do understand the balance between pushing myself to have social experiences and also ensuring that I am comfortable. And when it comes to social anxiety, this is kind of where this boundary comes in. Everybody thinks that I'm an extrovert, but I truly am an introvert. And having good boundaries around that time or time that I spend with myself ensures that I remain comfortable and continue to give for all the things that I'm responsible for or that I'm connected to. Values, to connect values and boundaries, values are things that are most important to you. Ideally, and this might help connect the dots for some of the places that these boundaries might show up for you. Ideally, your boundaries will reflect your values. So, what are your most important values, and how do your boundaries reflect these values is the true question here. So those are the different type of boundaries. I hope that through me talking through what they are and also sharing some personal examples and how those things showed up for me, they can help you kind of explore what do your boundaries look like. Are they porous? Are they rigid? Is there more work to be done? What does that look like? As I've approached turning 30, boundaries have been extremely, extremely important to me. And they can be difficult to establish, but it is also kind of like riding a bike. The more you do it, the easier it gets. Or it's like a muscle. The more that you flex it, the easier it is to lift that weight. I often think of the saying, I don't know who said it, but boundaries are how I can love you and myself at the same time, at the distance at which I can feel my full self and I can do that in relation and connection to someone else. And I'll say this with my full chest because it is just that important. Those that are not willing to respect your boundaries do not deserve to be in your life, period. Boundaries don't have to make sense to be respected. I've been in a lot of situations where I've tried to establish boundaries and it's turned into this circular conversation. And I think it often makes me come back to the thought that, we all have choices in life. As you establish these boundaries that are connected to your values, you have to stand on that. And if there's a point where you can't reach consensus with someone over a boundary that is yours, that is a point to disengage because that person is not for you and you do not deserve that. The last thing I'll leave you with is there's a book by Nedra Glover, Love Her, Love Her, Love Her. And it really helped me work through what my boundaries should look like in addition to the work that I did with my therapist. And so I wanted to share that book on this episode as kind of a closer to add to, the different things that you might ponder or think about with this episode. So the name of the book is Set Boundaries, Find Peace, A Guide to Reclaiming Yourself by Nedra Glover Tawwab. There's also an accompanying workbook that can go with that as well. I've gotten it as a gift from many friends because I truly do believe that establishing boundaries is that important. So definitely check that out. Also, if you want to do further research than that, therapistaid.com has a lot of nice things and worksheets or what have you as it relates to boundaries. But even if that isn't accessible, Googling boundaries and doing your own research is also definitely something that can be done as well. And as I have been told, TikTok is like the new Google. And I'm sure there are a bunch of TikToks and short little videos on boundaries that you might be able to relate to or resonate with more than this episode, because I truly do understand that as well. But yeah, I hope this has been helpful. This is boundaries, y'all. I hope y'all are implementing them, thinking about them. I hope this has prompted you to want to dive deeper into what that looks like. I even hope that this has helped you start to reevaluate some of the connections that you may have. But in any case, like I said, this whole project is for you to take what you can and leave what doesn't resonate. All right, I'm out.